Hello everybody and welcome to today's video. Today we're going to talk about Ajax, otherwise known as Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. This is a pretty important topic when it comes to modern web development, is because it's the technology that we can develop in the client side. It's JavaScript, so it's going to run in the browser, that allows our applications to seem very fluid and very dynamic, and so it's very dominant in use today. Really important for us as developers to be able to understand. I think you'll find once we walk through here and look at some sample code and take a look at how it works, that it's not too complicated. We're going to introduce a couple of items here kind of indirectly, some callbacks and things that you'll want to start to think about. But really the focus today is just an introduction to how it works and understanding that this is what makes our client side, our web applications on the client side, much more robust and rich. I had to work that word rich in there at some point in the semester. All right, so what do we need to know in order to use Ajax? And the good thing is that you've already been introduced to all of the topics so far. So we're just leveraging those existing things that we've talked about, this existing technology, and adding some more functionality to it. So it's going to work with the HTML, the CSS, because we're going to be returning, we're going to be exchanging data essentially between the client and the server. It's just like we do normally when our users request a page through their browser. The only difference is that we can make smaller requests for smaller chunks of data. So we're going to be working with HTML and CSS. We're going to be writing the Ajax requests and determining how to trigger those requests with JavaScript. And then we're going to have to be able to parse the DOM in order to update the user interface. So there you can see what the acronym stands for, Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. That XML portion of it's a little misleading at this point because while XML was kind of the original format that the data was transferred in, it's much more common nowadays to either use JSON, which I believe we'll talk about a little bit later on here towards the end of the semester. Or simply to return raw HTML or something. So just because we're using Ajax, it does not mean that we're going to use XML. In fact, I'm not really going to spend any time this semester covering XML. One, I don't like it. It's my own personal bias. And two, we won't have too much. We just want to simply have the time to get into too much of the, like this is the data exchange format. So as I mentioned, most modern sites use Ajax. A typical request looks like this. So if we start at the upper left-hand corner, we have our browser. An event occurs. And so what does an event mean? Well, it means that a user clicked a button or they submitted a form or, something happened within the browser. Recall that websites are very event-driven. That is, that the pages our applications are waiting for things to occur in order for that functionality, for something to happen in the application. Clicking a button causes something to be added to a shopping cart, or submitting a form causes the user to log in or become registered. So we wait for an event to occur, and there are some events that we can tie into that the browser generates for us, and then there are some events that we can tie into that the user generates for us, such as the click event. We'll create an object, we'll look at that in code, and then we'll send the request. This becomes a request then sent via the internet to the server. The server sees that response or sees that request. To the server, it's just an HTTP request. It's no different really than a normal request to the server. It creates a response, sends that data back. That data is sent back to the browser. Now, this is where it becomes the client side is where things become different because the client initiates the request. It's not a full HTTP request. That is, that we're not waiting for a full document to be returned back and parsed. Just like the response. The little code that we wrote, that waits for the response. And then that little bit of JavaScript handles that and then can update the page. And so we don't have to have the entire page. The server's not sending a full document. It's not sending something that starts with doc type and HTML and a head and a body. It's not having to parse that entire DOM object again. It's able to parse just a little snippet. And so that's what makes Ajax so beneficial performance-wise in our applications. Right, so specifically then, what we need in order to make this work, in order to develop some Ajax techniques or processes in our client side, is we need something called the XML HTTP request object, and we'll create that using JavaScript. From there, we're just writing JavaScript. We're potentially accessing the DOM API to manipulate the page. We may have some CSS, and oftentimes we will, but we don't necessarily have to work with that directly because oftentimes we've already applied the styles through our external style sheets, and so the styles are already in place. And then there may be a data transfer component. That can be XML, that can be JSON, that can just be a plain string value. And we'll see that today in the demo, that we're just going to have a plain string value. All right, so the first thing that we need to, as we're going down this path to implementation, the first thing that we need to be curious about is the XML HTTP request object itself and browser support. One of the themes that hopefully you're picking up on through the semester here is that browser support is always, as a web developer, that's one of the biggest issues that we deal with. And so that's really no different with the XML HTTP request object. Now, fortunately, modern browsers support this object well, and so you very rarely run into issues nowadays with the browser not supporting it. Older browsers, in particular Internet Explorer 5 and 6, and I've lost track of what version we're on with Internet Explorer. I think it's at least 11 though. But that's several years old, and so it's pretty rare that you run into browsers that are that old. I do, on occasion, have had some places that I've worked or some clients that have very unique or particular environments that have very old versions of Internet Explorer, but it's pretty rare. Browser support is good, and you can check for browser support. You're not going to see it in my sample code because I tend to not check for it anymore unless I have a very specific reason to, because of a client or because I know certain customers are actually using an old browser. But again, it's very rare for me to encounter that. And so you can check for it. So the first thing that we do is we create it, and we declare this object just like we would any other JavaScript variable. So we have to use the var keyword, name of our variable here, and then it equals new XML HTTP request, parentheses, semicolon. Okay, and make sure that you get the capitalization of this correct. So once we create that object, what this little bit of code here is that it allows us to check for it. So before we declare it, we can say if window.xml HTTP request. If it exists, if the browser understands that object, supports that object, this is going to return something. It's going to be true. So we can create it just like we did here. If this doesn't return anything, that means it's false, and we'll do this else branch. And in this case, you're creating an ActiveX object, and that ActiveX object is a Microsoft thing, and that's the only thing that works with IE6 and IE5. Right. So again, I don't do this check anymore. I don't expect you to as well, unless you have a very particular reason for any of the labs or anything. Though I don't worry about it. So you're not going to see any of this in the sample code, and that's the reason why. All right, so once we have that object, then we need to be able to interact with the server. All right, so again, this is creating on the client side our ability via JavaScript to send a request to the server and then parse the response. So there's a couple of things that we need to do. We need to open it, and then we'll need to send it. And each of those methods are going to be methods off of that XML HTTP request object that we created, and each one of them has their own parameters. So the first thing that we do is we open. We have to open before we can send. So with open, we have three methods or three arguments. The first is the method, second is the URL, and the third one is the async. All right, so for the first one, our method is going to be get or post, and we'll spend more time talking about get and post a little bit later. The big picture with get and post, for the most part right now, if you're not familiar with it or you've never heard it before, and you're just trying to become generally familiar with it, get usually we use for just getting a resource. We want to get an image, we want to get a page. We're not sending data to the server. Post then is what we typically use in order to send data to the server. A user submits a login form. They post the username and the password back to the server. They submit a registration form. They post their first name and the last name and the username and all the other form fields back to the server. Right. So the examples today, I'm just going to use get, and we'll maybe talk about post a little bit later on. The URL, that is the location of the file. So what are you trying to get, or where are you trying to send data to if you were to post? And then the third value is the async, and that's going to be true or false. And so again, for all of our demos, it's going to be true because we want things to be asynchronous. We want to be able to allow this asynchronous request to go to the server and wait for the response, but not to block the browser from continuing to operate. So the last thing, once we set this argument up, when we set this function call up, then the last thing that we need to do, the second thing that we need to do, there's a couple other pieces here. But as far as exchanging the data, then we need to send it. And The send has an argument. This is an optional argument, and the only time that you put values into here is if you're posting a request. So again, we're not going to do that in the demo right now, but just know that if you do find yourself down the road needing to post data, this is where you'll build a string, and you'll have to build it in key value pair, and then again, maybe we'll go over it. I'm not sure if we'll have time. All right, so this is an example then. So let's say that from that previous statement where we declared that XML HTTP request object, let's just say that I created it or called it XML HTTP. We have the open and the send methods on that object. So we say XML HTTP.open. There is our method get. There is the page, and then true, because I want this to be asynchronous. After I've set that up, you go ahead and execute the send function, and that's what actually creates that request to the server to get that page. Okay, as I mentioned, posting is a little bit different, and so your request method is obviously post instead of get. It's a page. You have to be able to post to a page. We'll probably leave this as true. You have to be able to, because when we work with forms and we work with how we send data back to a server, there's a content type HTTP header. Right, we talked about the HTTP request response, and we have all these HTTP headers that help define what we're looking for. It helps to add information to the request itself. And so with Ajax, because you're making an HTTP request, you can set additional headers using the set request header method. And so all this is doing then is adding a header called content type, and then telling it how the posted data is being encoded. Application X www form URL encoded. So when the server receives this, it can parse that header and it can understand the format of the data, so it can pull those key value pairs out. Don't be too worried about this. This is just an example. So if anything, it's here for you as a resource down the road. Once you have your open method with your arguments defined, so you know what you're going to do, you're going to post, you know what page you're going to post to, you've set this request header content type, then in your send method, as we talked about previously, you have a string value, which is your key value pairs. So if I had a login form and I had two form input fields, let's say that one of them was called username and one of them was called password, then I'd have username equals, and then the actual value from the user, ampersand, password equals, and then the actual value from that form field. Right? And then we just would have this key value pair, key equals value, and key equals value, and key equals value, until all of the form fields were sent back to the server. And that's how we'd actually communicate that data back to the server. All right, if you want to read a little bit more about XWWW form URL encoded, here's the specs from w3.org. It's worth taking a few minutes and reading. It just defines how the data is sent and some of the special chars, how those special characters are treated. Okay, so as I mentioned, it's important to understand here the purpose of that third argument and the fact that this is an asynchronous request. So you can set that third argument in the open function to true or false. True means that it's asynchronous. And the important piece to that, or the important concept of that, is that the page doesn't wait for the script to stop executing. Normally, when you run JavaScript in the browser, if you don't do some things asynchronously, then as the page loads, the browser has to stop and wait for that JavaScript to execute. And so a good example here, let's see if I can real quick show you guys. All right, so ignore this request right now, this function right now, and let's just say that I put an alert box right here. All right, this page, there's a script tag in the head section. Here's my alert. When the browser starts to parse this, it's going to parse from top to bottom. So it's going to start parsing these elements. It's going to enter the script tag. It's going to alert or execute this alert, which means that the alert will pop up. Inside of here, you can see that I have content inside of the body. That is, I have things that will be displayed on the page when you load it. What's going to happen, though, is simply because of this alert, right? And again, just ignore this function. This function doesn't even matter right now. Because of this alert, the browser is going to wait for this particular piece of JavaScript to finish executing before it continues to load the page. So if I go back to here, right, this is what this page is going to look like in just a moment. There should be this text here and this text here and a button. But when I reload this page, you can see there's nothing behind it, and it's waiting for me right now because the browser's waiting for that alert box to finish processing. In this case, execution pauses until I dismiss it. As soon as I dismiss it, the rest of the content comes. Right? That's an undesirable behavior because then the user has to wait while that JavaScript is being executed. Right? And that's what we want to avoid. And so we make things asynchronous, and then the browser doesn't have to wait for it. It can really take that request and handle it in the background. Right? With that, though, we have to be able to define a callback. And so what we'll say is Ajax make a request and do it asynchronously. So the browser can continue to go on and parse and do other things and run other JavaScript. But when that request is done, then it needs to know what function to execute when it returns a response. And so we call that the callback. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. We'll use the onReady state change event in order to look for the returned response and then execute a function. Right, and that'll look a little bit like this, and it'll make more sense when I put it in context and we look at the sample here. If it's false, then the request is considered blocking. That is, just like that example with the alert box, if you say that it's false, then the script has to wait for that request to return, and nothing else will happen in the browser. So it gives the appearance to the consumer, to the client, that the page is running slow. Now, there is a reason that is that argument. You might be thinking, well, if it's asynchronous, if it's Ajax, why would I ever do something that would be false? Well, sometimes you do need things to be, to happen in order, or you do need things to, there are some dependencies, and your functions do need to execute in a certain way. And so you can still make requests via Ajax to the server and tell your page to wait for the response. And sometimes that is important. Right, but we're gonna focus on the asynchronous request right now. Right, so not only will we do that asynchronously, we'll have to look for that response to come back. Then we'll also need to parse that response. And so there's two properties on that object. Once it returns, once we know that the response has returned from the server, from our Ajax request, that we can check. We have response text or response XML. If we're expecting XML, then we can use the response XML property. Everything else is response text. And again, because we're not going to use XML today, everything will be the response text. Okay. As far as the onReady state change, what we're looking for then are events. And again, web development is full of events and handling these events. If we define an event listener for a click event, that is, a user clicks a button, then we have a function that's called when that button is clicked. Right? Same thing with our Ajax request. We send the Ajax request, and we have to have a function defined to listen to the response, to know when that response has been returned so that we can parse it. And so on our XML object, we have the onReady state change event. And we can monitor that because every time the state of that XML request, that Ajax request changes, this event fires. This event fires and allows us to check. There's going to be, you'll see here, there are 5 statuses that we're going to check, as well, or 5 ready states that we're going to check, as well as ultimately the status as well. All right, so what we'll do is every time the state of our request changes, it can be one of these 5 ready states, which is, again, another property. And again, it'll be much clearer when we look at the actual code. All right, so we can have a state of 0, not initialized. We can have a state of 1, server connection established. 2, request received. 3, processing request. And 4, request finished and response is ready. By and large, the one that we're checking for is going to be a ready state of 4. That means that the server has returned a response and we're ready to do something with it. The other thing that we need to check is the status. And the status goes back to our HTTP status from any page that we request. And then so if we open up, I'll open up Developer Tools, go to the Network tab, and we can just open up something like usd.edu. All right, you see all these values that are going to start to populate here along the left-hand side, 200, 304. 200 means OK. That's an HTTP status code. That means that the server received our response, our request, and it sent a response. 304 means that the response was not modified, so to use cache. All right, and there's a bunch of status codes. We really only care about right now with our Ajax request at 200. We need to know that the request was received and a response was sent. All right, so tying that all together, this is then the code that does that. So this is the event. So we say XML HTTP.onReadyStateChange. Whenever that state changes, it's going to call this function. So we have this anonymous function here, and inside of it, we check the ready state. So XML HTTP.readyState, that's equal to 4, and XML HTTP.status is equal to 200, and then we can do something with that response. Right? We have the response text, and we can get that value out. Right? So that's how we check for it. All right, so I've uploaded some code into our class folder. You'll find inside of the, I think I put it in the JavaScript folder, you'll find ajax.html and ajax.txt. What I did, because you can't just simply put these files on your desktop and run them. You'll likely run into issues. You can with Firefox, but you can't with Chrome and some of the other browsers. So what I did was I downloaded them and I put them in the document root on my Linux machine here. So in var www.html, you can see here's ajax.html and here's ajax.txt. So that allows me, when I open up my browser, to go to localhost and ajax.html. The reason that this is going to work a little bit better is because then these requests are, it's a little bit more realistic in that the browser thinks that this is an actual website. The fact that it's on localhost is really irrelevant to the browser. The browser makes an HTTP request for a resource on some server, and that's all it really cares about. Okay, I'm going to keep my developer console open, developer tools open. And what I would encourage you to do, as I have in the past, is that as you start to do development, especially with JavaScript, and now in particular with Ajax, is that between the console and the network tab, you have those open so that you can see what's going on. If you have syntax error in your JavaScript, they'll pop up here in the console, and so hopefully you'll see those a little bit quicker and understand that you have a problem and can fix that, and you spend a little less time wondering what the heck's going on with your code. As far as the code itself, this then is the entirety of what we talked about, and I'm gonna actually get rid of this little check here. I'll just comment it out for now because we just really don't. This in particular actually makes no sense, and I did in fact mean to delete that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm not going to bother to check for that. I'm just going to set this object declaration and initialization up right here. Right, so there's our variable. I called mine XML HTTP. It equals a new XML HTTP request object. Right, so that gives us our object to make our Ajax request. You can define, and you'll oftentimes see this Ajax request defined in this order. So I'll say that from the XML HTTP object, okay, remember this is an object, I have the onReadyStateChange, and I want it to execute this function. Okay. If we don't, I don't know if we're going to get to it with JavaScript, but if you think you're going to continue to do more web development, I would encourage you at this point to look up the difference between an anonymous function and a named function in JavaScript, because that'll help. It's how a lot of JavaScript developers do it. It's essentially what we're doing here. This is an anonymous function in a way. So take some time to look that up. So every time the state changes, it's going to call this function. And we're going to go through several state changes with our request. And so in order to not handle state 0 or state 1 or state 2, states that we don't care about, remember I said we only care about 4 when we have a response, we're going to put the majority of the code here, and we don't need this. We're going to put the majority of the code, the stuff that we actually want to have executed on the response being returned from the server, inside of this if statement. So on the XML HTTP object, we can check the ready state. Okay, I said we want to check for a state equal to 4 and the status, and the status is equal to 200. Right? Because this might trigger a couple of times, and we can put this. I'll just go ahead and do this to help. I'll log the console here and just some text so you can see how many times this is in fact called. Alright, so we'll see that log to the console. Right, once the state's there, so state of 4, status of 200, then what I'll do is I'll access or traverse the DOM. I'll get this element by ID, my div, access its inner HTML property, and simply set that inner HTML property to the response text that was sent back from the server. Okay, here is how I tie that all or set that all up within the web page itself. Here's the div with the ID. So what'll happen is you'll see when we load this page, you'll see this content right here, H2, this text will change, and then this button, I have to find the on-click event to call that function Ajax request. So that's how all this code is going to get executed. I guess before I do that, so that defines our callback, right? When this event changes, this is the function that's executed. This opens the request, so it's going to be a GET request to ajax.html, that was a typo there, but to ajax.text. Third value is true, it's going to be asynchronous, and then the last part here we're going to send. So open and then send. The content of ajax.txt is just simply this. This is the response from the server, and I can just, even at this point, we can just put an arbitrary text here. Okay, that resource exists on the server, right? It's right here, it's inside the doc root of our local host, and so we'll be able to make that request. All right, let's go ahead and see if this works. All right, refresh the page. There's an error that we don't have to care about that one. Let's see, I'm going to open up the network tab, and I'm going to do this one more time, just because I want to talk about the request here before we see the actual Ajax. All right, so I went to the browser and I initiated a request from the browser. When we do that, that causes the browser to load that entire document. And typically, if this was a more robust page, you'd see everything reload and you'd see a flicker and it'd have to go through the DOM and all that. You can look at the HTTP request here on the network tab if you select whatever page. So in this case, ajax.html is the page I requested. And you can see that the response is, in fact, there's all of our headers, and here's the response. Doc type HTML, HTML head script. All right, so the page had to process all of that again, and this is a very small page, and so you can imagine that if this is a bigger page, we'd have a much longer processing time. All right, what's going to happen now with this Ajax request? Oh, yep, made a mistake there. Refresh that. Okay, so I'm getting a 404 requesting ajax.html. That page doesn't exist because that's lowercase and that's uppercase. I forgot to save this file, so I changed this to ajax.txt and I forgot to save it. So I'll make that save, go back here and refresh. Right, and there it is. I return the response. Okay, here's that initial request. This is the response, that full body. Here is our response from our Ajax request, just the contents of that file. So you can see that I was able to make through the client a much smaller request. We clicked the button, it triggered that event, made that request to the server returned the content, returned that resource, and then using that document.getElement by ID, I updated the page dynamically. I just changed this portion of that document. I didn't change everything else. I didn't have to parse the DOM again. If we look at the console, here you can see, as I talked about, that ready state change event. Right? This goes through all of those states, and so we don't care about any of those states until we get to state 4, which means that we've had a response return. And so you can see that with this code right here. Ready state 1, 2, 3, 4, and then finally because ready state was 4, we updated the content. Right? Our if statement was true, so we are able to, this was all true, so we were able to take the response, which we get through this property, and update the inner HTML of this DOM node, of that element on the page. All right, this becomes right here almost like a boilerplate. Anytime you want to make an Ajax request, you can do, minus some of this console.log, you can do the same thing over and over and over again. Right? Every Ajax request I make on a page, if I'm using just JavaScript, you can do this over and over and over again. The only thing that changes then is what we do inside of here. Right? What are you updating? What is your response from the server, and what are you updating on the page? And then obviously, what are you requesting? Okay, and then of course, if you were running post data, you'd have to send that as an argument there. So you can do this if you need to do an Ajax request. If I say, okay, make an Ajax request to a server to get a particular, something off the server, you can do this same format. You have the same structure. The only thing that you're changing is what you're requesting and then what you're doing with that response. Right? So this stuff changes. So you can use this type of code over and over again. All right, well, That's our introduction to Ajax, right? This is a relatively simplified version of it because I just want you to get the basic understanding of how Ajax works. So take a look at this code, try to get it set up, try to get it to working. Of course, if you have problems, if something's not clear, you just can't get something to work, let me know. Do take some time if you try to run this off your desktop. If you just download both these files to your desktop and double click and open it, it's probably not going to work, at least not with all browsers. With Firefox it does, with Chrome and some of the others it doesn't. So you see here I have them both downloaded to my desktop. If you just click on them, you have this in your URL, file, blah, 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 it may or may not work. And you can see here it's not even working. So you may run into some issues with that. So another reason that we set up this LAMP server, one was primarily for the experience of it, and two, so that you do have a web server up and running to be able to experiment with things like this. So try to get that to run. Let me know if you have questions. In the next video, we'll talk about Ajax and jQuery so that you can do Ajax with either technology that you choose to use. So, all right, that sounds good. Thanks. I'll see you guys in the next video.